So if anybody has any questions, just go ahead and type them in the chat box, and Anne is going to be monitoring that throughout the presentation. So thank you all for being here tonight. Like Anne mentioned, my name is Kelly Palich, and I'm with the Living History and Heritage Program with Howard County Rec and Parks, and I'm also the president of the Upper Patuxent Archaeology Group, which is a nonprofit volunteer group. We're a chapter of the Archaeological Society of Maryland. Anybody can join and volunteer with us. So we're based, our office, our home site normally is based out of Ellicott City, kind of right near Centennial Park, but things have been kind of thwarted a little bit with COVID, so been working from my home. I've been an archaeologist and museum educator for about 20 years. I have a bachelor's degree in anthropology from Washington College on the Eastern Shore, and I have a master's in public anthropology from American University in DC. I've been working with the county for, almost 4 years now, and love my job, love what I do. I get to really work with all the sites and do public programming with the county. So any questions that you might have about what we do with the county or with what we call UPAG, I'll actually answer some of those questions and talk about that at the end. But tonight I want to take you on a virtual journey of just some few of the sites that have been documented in Howard County. I've picked sites that have been deemed significant because they have a lot of research, or they're important for their own particular ways. Or sites that I've personally worked on throughout the county. I think the only site that I haven't worked on was the first one. But I also want to say that with Rec and Parks and UPAG, we do a monthly series of talks called Archaeology in Your Community, and they are free, and lately they've been virtual, so they're all Zoom. And our next one is going to be on Saturday, November 14th, and we have a local historian, Steve Curtis, who will be talking about the lost mill town of Triadelphia. So I will share my email at the end of this presentation, and if anybody's interested in joining that talk this Saturday, just shoot me an email and I will send you the link. So a lot of those talks that we do monthly focus on a lot of the sites that have been found in Howard County. So I want to first start out with some statistics that will help shed light on the types of sites, how many sites, and sort of how archaeology is played out county by county. This slide shows the number of sites that have been identified in Howard County as well as surrounding counties. So Prince George's County is on there, as well as Anne Arundel. I know Laurel sort of encompasses three of those counties. So you may notice that uneven distribution of sites. So Anne Arundel County has 1,694 sites documented. That's not to say that they've all been excavated, but they've been identified and recorded. Prince George's, 1,194, Montgomery, 765, and then Howard, we're all the way down we have 307 sites that have been documented. I mean, Howard County has almost, has well over 300 additional sites over Howard County, and there's a particular reason for that. So, and it's actually pretty significant to the preservation of archaeological resources in Howard County and Maryland in general. So Anne Arundel and Prince George's County, if any of you are familiar, they actually have ordinances that protect archaeological cultural resources, both above and below ground. And these ordinances, they require developers to conduct some sort of research before the property is developed. So that way, if they find a site, they record it. I'm sure, there are places in Anne Arundel County or Prince George's County where you see a cemetery that's smack dab in the middle of a subdivision because they had to work around that. Howard County, there's nothing like that. The only time archaeology is required to be done is when it's done on state property like Patuxent Valley State Park. And I can tell you that there are very few sites that have actually been investigated at Patuxent Valley State Park because they haven't had to. On county property, that's kind of a hit or miss. On Rec and Park property, we actually have a lot of acreage because I'm the archaeologists representing them, they do have to do archaeology. On other county property, you know, they reach out to me, but, you know, sometimes it slips through the cracks. There's no specific ordinance saying that they have to have it done. And then land that falls under federal funding or federal protection through the National Historic Preservation Act has to have archaeological work done. And the greatest example of that right now is Old Ellicott City. And they're actually going to be starting the Section 106 process. When they remove the historic buildings from Lower Main Street, they have to have archaeological monitoring done, and that is by federal law. And then we have 2 historic districts in Howard County, Old Ellicott City and Lawyers Hill. So archaeology has to be done because they are protected under the National Historic Preservation Act. Hopefully this will change. I know in Baltimore County, developers are a little more cautious about, you know, the protection of these sites, but in Howard County, I can't really say much because I'm a county employee, but it'll take a grassroots effort to get that passed through. It is on the radar of the county council, which is a good thing. So in Maryland and North America, we study the past in different time periods, I guess. Europe has much more because they're much older in antiquity. Here we study prehistory and we study history, and we designate our archaeological sites based on these 2 time periods. Prehistory is the study of history before the written language and the history of before colonization. So you have your Native American cultures, your woodland, your archaic, your Paleo-Indian cultures, which we have a lot of in this area. And then you have your historic archaeology sites, which are post-contact, post-European contact. And that's sort of the 2, you know, frames of references that we use when we date sites. So here we have the distribution of prehistoric sites versus historic sites in Howard County. And you can see that prehistoric, you know, is well over half of what the sites that have been documented in Howard County, with 39% of historic. That's because a lot of the sites that have been documented in Howard County have been along the Patuxent River and the Patuxent River, which all fall within wetlands, so they have to have that work done. And these were prime areas for the Native American base camps and resource procurement. There's a lot of natural quartz in the area that they would use. And another resource in the area was soapstone. There's a thick vein of soapstone that runs through the western part of the county. Most of the historic sites that have been documented archaeologically are associated with the standing structures that are already visible, but there are many more that remain below ground that have not been identified. So with prehistoric sites, different time periods. So we have the Paleo-Indian period, we have the Archaic period, and we have the Woodland period. And we designate those by changes in technology, changes in resources, changes in environment. So the Woodland period is the time right before colonization. And Paleo-Indian, if you think of like the mastodon and the nomadic cultures. And then Archaic, they were developing better technologies, the atlatl. They were creating these steatite bowls, and they were less nomadic. They were semi-permanent in areas, hunting grounds. The majority of our sites that we have identified in Howard County that have been identifiable by time period is Archaic. We know that based on Captain John Smith's 1608 map, when he explored the Chesapeake Bay, he did not travel this far up north the Patuxent River, probably because he couldn't get a ship up this far, but he did not map any tribes. I know right now that there are no documented Native American village sites this far north of the Patuxent. And I was asking Dr. Bob Wall, who's done a lot of research in that in the area, and he thinks it's just, you know, there weren't villages this far north. And also, if there were, the soils that we have in the Piedmont aren't very well, they don't preserve the sites the same way as the coastal plain soils do. So not to say that there wasn't any woodland period villages, but we haven't located any. But we do know that the two tribes, Piscataway and the Susquehannock, were using this area to hunt and obtain resources like quartzite. And then 17% is a woodland period, so right before contact. And we can tell that because they've been finding pottery and the different types of projectile points. So if you also notice, there are 0 Paleo-Indian sites recorded in Howard County. And like I said, they're associated with nomadic groups who traveled across the Bering Strait at least 11,000 years ago. Dr. Zach Singer, he's actually going to be giving us a talk for us, I think, in February on, he works with the Maryland Historical Trust, and he's synthesizing all these Paleo-Indian sites in Maryland. And so he might find more information that might tell us something different, but he will be speaking on that. I am not a Native American prehistoric archaeologist. I'm a historic archaeologist, so that's not my jam there. So I also broke down briefly the distribution of historic sites in Howard County. And this is Howard County now. It was the western part of Anne Arundel County, the hinterlands, up until 1840, 1850, when it became Howard County. So all the 17th century sites, there's been 2 sites documented as potential 17th century. There is a house that they believed possibly part of it could have been built in the 17th century. And there's a site that I'm going to be talking about tonight that they originally thought was 17th century, but it's not. The majority of the sites are 19th century. If you know the history of Ellicott City, not much colonial history before historic Ellicott City has been documented. This part of the county was considered the hinterlands, barren, so it wasn't settled. Most of the settlement was in the coastal plain along the lower Patapsco and lower Patuxent rivers. But you start getting sites, by the 18th century. People are attempting to establish these tobacco farms, and then they eventually switch over to crop diversification. And then 20th century sites, there's a lot of tenant sites, which I'll be talking about one of those. After the Civil War, a lot of tenant farming occurred. And multi-temporal just means that if a house was built in 1815, somebody lived and occupied that space for 100 or 200 years. So the moment you've all been waiting for, we'll begin our virtual tour of sites through Howard County. All of these sites hold some level of significance in the county, whether they be on property that's protected, that's listed on the National Register, or if the site itself has, significance in, preservation of its stratigraphy or what it can tell us about the past. The majority of sites in Howard County, so we have 307 sites recorded. I will tell you a large portion of that has just been documented and never investigated. A lot of the prehistoric sites that have been found have been lithic scatter. So somebody saw a bunch of flaked stone on the ground and they recorded that site. So these are sites that have been documented and that continue to be documented and are considered to be significant. So as you take this journey, please consider the significance of the preservation of these sites and keep these sites safe for future generations. So the first site I want to talk about, it's in Elkridge, Maryland. It's kind of near the airport. It's called the Beehive site, and this site was deemed eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. Unfortunately, this was excavated, I want to say, early 90s, so I did not work at this site. The only information I have is from the site files. So this site was a deeply stratified site, which means that, and I'll show you an image of what I mean by stratigraphy shortly, but the levels that we excavate tell you a very good picture about the different occupations of the site. And it was believed to be a late archaic quarry-related extraction site. So they found a lot of quartz that had been quarried by the Native American cultures. And they also believed that they were processing stone material here. The local tributary to this site is Shallow Run. So there have been a lot of sites identified along Shallow Run and all the other tributaries along that side of the Patapsco River. So there's actually a lot of pretty well preserved Native American sites near around the border of Howard County and Anne Arundel County. So the principal focus of these short-term occupations, like I said, was the procurement and early stage processing of local quartz and quartzite cobbles that were obtained from the local stream bed. Due to the presence of fire-cracked rock cobbles, which represent, and I'll show you an image of that shortly, it represented a hearth feature. It's also believed that the site was used as a short-term camp. So these groups would come, either the Susquehannocks would travel down from southern Pennsylvania, or the Algonquin Piscataway would come up from southern Maryland, and they would camp here. They would obtain their resources. They would, do some early stage lithic production, and then they would go back to their main camps, their satellite camps. Like I said, this site was deemed eligible for the National Register due to its subsurface integrity and how well it was preserved underneath the ground, and its ability to address questions of local and regional lithic procurement strategies. So in the early 1990s, a phase 1 survey was conducted, and that the map that you see on the left here, or your right, on your left, is a map of that phase 1 survey. That's where they dig their, every 20 meter, it looks like maybe, 20 meter shovel test pits. And the two areas that are hatched out there were areas where they found significant artifact clusters or features. And in that phase, they found over 22,000 artifacts. Within all three phases, they found 22,000 artifacts. The phase 2 investigation, they studied these areas of greater concentration, and they were able to identify where there were some cultural features. And then because this site, unfortunately, they had to do some wetland mitigation that they could not get around. They had to do a phase 3 excavation, which means they had to basically strip the area. They had to remove everything to get all the information because it was going to be destroyed. So once archaeologists determine the area of high probability, they can place test units to identify the location of any subsurface features. This is just a more detailed map showing the areas of high concentrations, as well as where they placed phase 3 block excavations. So here it shows you where they really focused on removing any information that they thought was significant. These types of maps are very common and very significant to archaeologists, because once you remove the artifacts and once you excavate the features, that information is lost forever. So that's why you always see archaeologists photographing, drawing, mapping. We're just documenting everything that we possibly can. Unfortunately, since we're virtual, and I'm assuming that these sites are actually down, these artifacts are actually stored at the Maryland Archaeological Conservation Lab in Southern Maryland. These are some of the images of the material culture from these sites. And the artifact assemblage is dominated by lithic debris related to core preparation and reduction from large cobbles. So they would quarry these large cobbles, and they would eventually whittle them down until you get these projectile points. There's a whole lithic production that goes on, and it's not easy. So you would take your cobble, you would make these bifaces like you see on the right, and then you eventually pressure flake them into these spear points or arrowheads. Lithic procurement was not the only type of activity that occurred at the site. Like I said, there was evidence of a short-term camp, including hammerstones, like you see in the bottom left-hand side, and other groundstone tools that they were using to either grind nuts or berries, or do other kinds of chores that were outside of tool production. One of the really cool things from this site is that they were able to do a protein residue analysis on some of the projectile points, and they were able to identify through DNA some of the species of animals being hunted with the tools. That was pretty cool. So one of the biggest determinants of a short-term camp was the presence of fire-cracked rock. And fire-cracked rock is just large pieces of rock that have been heated to such a high temperature that they shatter. So they've been altered. They're very angular and they have sharp edges, and they're also usually thermally altered, so they're reddish in tint. So this image here is an example of one of the fire-cracked rock features from the beehive site found right around this area, which is interesting. And they found a number of these features throughout the site. The other significance to the site was the stratigraphy of the soil itself. And stratigraphy is just defined as the different layers of soil or rock underneath the Earth's surface. And archaeologists take layer by layer because each layer represents a different, I can never explain this good, different period of time, a different depositional period. So if you have flooding, you have a layer, or if you have, a fallen down structure, that creates another layer. So each layer tells us a story about the past in sequential order, ideally. So soils here appear in the archaeological record as differentiated layers of material that contrast in color, texture, structure, and chemical composition. So we actually have to record the color of each level. We have to record the texture or feel and the hue, because that's all very important information. So we have to be very careful to make these distinctions in our notes. Normally you have your O horizon, which is the top layer of organic material, and then an A horizon, which is your topsoil, and then your E and B subsoil, and then your C, your subsoil, your parent material. So generally, when archaeologically speaking, A is the most important one because that is the preserved layer that contains the most significant artifacts and the features. Here you can see in the image on the left, the darker layer down here is actually a buried A horizon. So this is the ground surface of the Archaic period, and it's been well preserved over the last thousands of years. So that is why the site was so significant, because anything that they would have found from the Archaic period would have been well preserved and not disturbed. So that is called a buried A horizon. Unfortunately, they excavated as much as they could before the site was completely destroyed. And part of the site is now under a parking lot and in a wetland, unfortunately. So our next slide, we're going to move right along through time here, the Colonial period. And much of the Colonial period, people were settling in the coastal plain, like around Anne Arundel County, the lower Patuxent area. That's where your larger tobacco plantations were. But this site truly explains and shows how Howard County, or Western Anne Arundel County, was truly a frontier in the early 18th century colonial era. Before I begin this, I will tell you that as more data and technology becomes available to researchers, site interpretations can change. Oh, first of all, I see that there's a question. Does anybody have a question about the prehistoric site? And I saw that there was a question in the Q&A. Is Anne there? All right, well.
No, I'm so sorry, Kelly. I'm here. I just could not get my mouse going.
Okay. I saw a question in the Q&A.
Oh yeah, no, it just came through. Thanks for seeing that.
Why was the beehive site given that name? I have no idea, and I'll talk about that a little more with our next site, because I have no idea why this next site is called the Raven site. People just sort of name sites based on what they're feeling. Sometimes people name sites after themselves. I've named a site after, some sites after my volunteers who found the site. So I don't really know. They may have found a beehive on the site and they may have gotten stung. So it just, yeah, but so this next site, this colonial site is called the Raven site. And I've only recently discovered something about this site, having time to do a little bit more research. And it challenges everything that was thought to be known about the site. However, I'm going to present this from what was known and then talk about at the very end what that change in the historical research has told me. This is a common problem in the field of archaeology. There's a lot of sites that have been identified in the past 30, 40 years. And as technology changes, people are able to obtain more information. So a lot of research that has been done on sites is not always accurate. Unfortunately, this is a little more challenging. We did find descendants of what we thought was the site, but unfortunately, the original research that was done was not correct. And I'll mention that in a moment. But the Raven site, it's located right on the border of Howard County and Montgomery County in the Triadelphia Reservoir. And it was initially identified in 2002 by archaeologists Wayne Clark and Paul Inashima. And they were surveying the area of the Triadelphia Reservoir and the T. Howard Duckett Reservoir for Native American resources. They were looking for caves or petroglyphs, anything, I know that there were some soapstone quarries. But during their survey, they observed fragments of reddish blue. Oh no. I'm trying to figure, okay, there we go. Reddish blue and gray stoneware and fragments of a 17th century Bellarmine jug, which are on the bottom left-hand side. They didn't do any excavations. They just did a walkover and they found these two fragments. And I don't even know what part of the Bellarmine jar they found. They didn't say if it was the face, but they did not collect it. They left it there. So there's no documentation of that whatsoever based on their, except for their word. And they could not be relocated later. So based on this, they believe that this area was the location of a late 17th to early 18th century ranger station, which served to protect Maryland's colonial frontier. The site was recorded and no further work was done. Normally, this site is actually inundated underneath the Triadelphia Reservoir, which has been dammed up from the Patuxent River. So I don't think they really had a whole lot of time left. A little bit of Howard County history in the colonial era. It's located north of the fall line. The Upper Patuxent River Valley is located within the Piedmont Plateau, an area characterized by rolling hills and many rivers and their tributaries. So the name, the Patuxent River, actually means rolling waters, and it got its name from all of its rolling waters, and they couldn't always navigate their ships that far up the Patuxent in this area because of that. This area, during early colonial settlement, it was explored and it was deemed barren and infertile because the landscape was barren, because the Native Americans were reported to have done a practice where they would burn large areas of land to attract deer and other animal to hunt. So people thought that this area was not fertile for tobacco planting. As arable land became less available throughout the tidal region, and more settlers began to immigrate up the Patapsco River, some of these tobacco plantations, while not as large as the ones in southern Maryland, they started beginning to appear in the Piedmont Plateau on the Upper Patuxent around 1720. So this map here shows the 1795 settlement of the area. And Howard County is not even on this map because it's not a county yet. Elkridge Landing is here. And that was considered the major port in this area for tobacco on the Patapsco River. So the Patuxent River actually comes up and ends right there. So while the previous map shows very little settlement, this map from 1794 shows that there was settlement that had been well established by 1794. Many of the earliest settlers did start smaller tobacco plantations, and enough farmers planted tobacco that the tobacco warehouses and a port were eventually established at Elkridge Landing. Land encompassing the Raven site was located over here with the smaller red circle, and it was on the present border of Howard and Montgomery counties. And right now that area is under the water. The Patuxent River was not that wide until it was dammed up in the 40s. It's located just south of the historic Greensbridge Road, which was a major thoroughfare from Baltimore to Frederick. And most planters in this area traveled this road to ship their crop to England via Elkridge Landing. And by this time, a lot of prominent families in Howard County had, and prominent families in Prince George's County had begun to settle the area. So there's the Snowden family, there's the Dorseys, there's the Ridgeleys, Ellicott, Warfields, Carrolls. So they were already in this area, had their thing going on with the iron forges and tobacco plantations. By 1794, what was believed to be the original owner of the Raven site was no longer alive, nor were any of his remaining relatives still in the area. So there's no structure that lies within that area that was thought to be part of the Hutchcraft family. That's going to change though. So the Raven site, it was called Hutchcraft's Fortune because that was the name of the land patent that was believed to be in this area. Is located within the Triadelphia Reservoir, and it's normally underwater. Right now it is currently underwater. You can see here from the image on the left, how barren the area looks. If you guys are familiar with Brighton Dam and the Azalea Garden, if you go to the Azalea Garden and look across the reservoir, you can normally see the site when it's not covered with water. And the image on the right shows the general location of the site. So in 2002, there was a period of drought, which allowed the site to be uncovered. And additional droughts in 2006, plus dam repairs, allowed the Lost Towns Project of Anne Arundel County to conduct a systematic pedestrian survey and metal detecting survey to record any colonial period occupation. So this site is actually on the property of Washington Suburban Sanitation Company. So they reached out to Lost Towns to do some more research on the site while it was exposed. During a period of historically low water levels in 2006, archaeologists and volunteers from the Lost Towns Project conducted a 3-day, I think it was actually a 2-day salvage investigation, including a controlled surface collect where they would lay out this grid and they would walk and document wherever they found artifacts. And they identified a 200-foot by 200-foot area. This square right here, this square, which had the greatest concentration of artifacts. And they also did a metal detecting survey, and they conducted archival research on the location of the site. What they found proves that the area was in fact not a 17th century ranger station, but an early to mid 18th century, what they believe to be a tobacco plantation, one of the earliest settled in the Piedmont region. And the next slide. And so these other areas, these other blocks, they sort of looked at, but not really. They really focused on this hatched square right here. And that's going to be another issue that I'll mention later. So this is a land patent that the Lost Towns found in the archives. And the area that's highlighted in red is the area that they said was our site. And the river's not labeled on here. This was Hutchcraft's Fortune, and that was purchased by a gentleman named Thomas Hutchcraft in 1732. And this original land patent was a 175-acre patent, and it was a tobacco plantation. So they lived here until the 1770s, where everybody either died or moved away. And then I haven't really had a chance to go into, I think it went to some other relatives and tenants after that. I don't want to go into too much detail about this family because this research is not correct. I want to get more into what we found and what is correct. The area that we're really looking at is in this area that I've highlighted here, and I'll show you how I figured that out later. So during the 2006 investigations, the Lost Towns crew recovered 1,120 artifacts, most of which dated between 1700 and 1780. The interesting thing with this site is that due to dam construction in the 1940s, it basically blew away all the topsoil, all the plow zone, and it left the subsoil exposed. So features are very, very easy to find in this deflated soil. And all of these artifacts were basically on top of the living area that was occupied during the 18th century. It made things very easy to find features. So the majority of the artifacts dated between 1700 and 1780 and represented what was believed to be a middle class tobacco plantation. So recovery included a lot of ceramics. You see some ceramics here. Some white salt glazed stoneware, which is some fancy tableware, and some more white salt glazed stoneware here. A lot of the pottery that was found is a lot of this utilitarian ware, tankards and bottles and jars and these serving platters, which was interesting. The metal detecting survey actually found a lot of buckles, buttons, a lot of tobacco pipe, and a lot of horse hardware, which is interesting. And I do have these artifacts in my lab if anybody's ever interested in coming to look at them. So the deeper that we look into the research, this site, the interpretation of these artifacts are going to change. Until I found the research that I recently found, these were all interpreted to be part of a household, of a tobacco plantation, and from the mid 18th century. So the next slide. When they did their metal detecting survey, they found what they believed was a cellar feature or a subfloor pit. And looking at the distribution of architectural artifacts like brick, nails, hinges, and window glass, they think that they thought that they found, or they could project where they thought the original plantation structure was, which is this image here. The red square is where they located the feature. They did not excavate the feature, they just kind of documented it. And the projected building size, I don't know how they got that. I don't know how they got the orientation, but yeah, so due to severe soil deflation, further work was not deemed critical. They didn't think that any significant information would come from this. You know, if people could get out there and excavate that feature in the future, great. If not, that's okay. The image here, like I said, was a distribution map. And the survey that they did only lasted 2 days. So they had very limited time out here before the water rose again. In the 2019-2020 season, there was another period of dam repair, and the watershed manager reached out to me and was interested in having people go back out there to really document the site further and, you know, provide material for them to interpret the site. So our initial goal was to continue to document surface distribution, because it was about 14 years since the last investigation. So, you know, even more deflation could have exposed more artifacts. And we also wanted to relocate that feature one and study that feature. Really document whether or not they had found the house site. So we did a metal detecting survey. The difference between the metal detecting survey they did versus what we did, they did not a discriminatory. They were not looking for iron. They were not looking for nails or any kind of architectural metal. They were looking for the cool stuff, the coins and the silver and the pewter, which I don't really know why they did that. we did a non-discriminatory metal detecting survey, and we found a lot more that gave us a lot more information. So what we found last fall, we attempted to retrace the original datum points, which we could not find. Well, we found them, but I think that they had moved because of the water. So luckily we had found an area of concentration, and we just happened to put this unit, this 10-foot by 10-foot unit on top of this area. We noticed a little differentiation, little difference with the soil vegetation. And luckily, in this unit here, we put down 2 other units, didn't find anything there. This is the 3rd unit we put down, and we found this squarish angular feature. And it was pretty much in the same location as in the location where they found feature 1. So it was very square in nature, and we thought that, okay, this is a cellar hole. They were correct. What we found, we excavated 2 units. The shape and the nature of this feature, however, suggested that this was not a cellar hole. It was only about 1.5 feet deep, and it was very round and not uniform. So the majority of artifacts that came from this were architectural. We found brick, nail. We found a lot of butchered animal bones. I would say the majority of the artifacts were animal bones, and also a large percentage of daub, which is basically baked clay. And they would use daub, hardened clay, in their architectural buildings. There's more daub than there was brick. And that's very indicative of having an earth-fast dwelling, an earlier colonial type structure. Based on the evidence here, I interpreted this feature as a clay borrow pit where they would dig a hole to extract clay for, whatever reasons, building, and then they backfilled it at a later date with butchered bones. So I think what happened was during a butchering season, they just basically refilled this hole with the butchering trash. And then the architectural debris possibly is related to, demolition debris of an earlier structure. So we need to do more research on what happened at the site after, the 1770 period. Another exciting find from this site, so I reached out to archaeologists with the Maryland Historical Trust, and they came out and helped us conduct a remote sensing survey on the site to try to locate any other buried features. We were running out of time at this point. The dam repairs had been completed. And they ran this survey for us, Matt McKnight and Zach Singer, and they found this area down here that was suspect. So these shadows in the ground represents, pit features or something that had been disturbed underneath the ground. And they surveyed just up to this point, and then they were very curious about this over here because it kind of looks rectangular. And this is done using a gradiometer and other pit features. So because different machines pick up different information, they brought out their ground penetrating radar and they put these 2 pieces of information together. So the chief archaeologist, Matt McKnight with MHT, was able to compile all this data for us. And the original raw data on the left versus what he sort of projected on the right. These 2 blue circles here are what we call nail clouds that we discovered when we were doing our metal detecting. And this nice rectangular building sits right in between those 2 nail clouds. And then these other yellow are just other pit features, whether natural or man-made, I'm not sure. So this feature was actually located just outside the original survey area that was done in 2006. I think it was still covered by water, which is why they missed it. But the structure itself measures about 40 to 60 feet, which was quite large for the frontier period. But what we believe the Hutchcraft family was sort of slightly on the wealthier side of socioeconomic status. This was like, you know, you always find the best piece of information the last day of field work. So this is sort of that. This is actually the beginning of the quarantine that we were able to get out there. So we haven't been able to get back out and ground truth this, but it's covered by water now. And hopefully, I think they're going to lower the water again in a year and we'll get back out there. But like I had mentioned before, the changes with historical research. There's a lady named Jody Frey. Some of you may know her. She's plotted every single land patent in Howard County. And I was playing with Google Earth and I finally got this file to work. And I noticed that the land where our site is, which is marked by the red star, is not within Hutchcraft's fortune. Hutchcraft's fortune is this whole area here. It has this angular shape. And our site's over here. It was in a patent called Green's Delight. And right there, if you go back to the 1794 map, Green's Delight was owned by a gentleman named Richard Green. I don't know much about him yet because I haven't had time to do the research, but he established Greensbridge Road. That's who it's named after. And this little sun icon is a mill. So our structure could be a mill. It could be a house associated with Richard Green. I'm not sure where he lived yet. So this changes the whole interpretation of the site. And it's just one thing to look forward to down the road. Whether or not he had a tavern on the site along the road, I don't know yet. So if anybody's interested in doing historical research, definitely contact me. So yeah, lots of future investigation, and investigation will tell the truth about this site. So moving along in time, our next site takes us into the late 18th and 19th centuries, early 19th centuries. Many of you may recognize this site. This is the historic Belmont, built by the Dorsey family in the 18th century. The land was originally part of a 1,300-acre land tract called Moore's Morning Chance, and it was eventually purchased by Caleb Dorsey Sr., and he sold it to his son Caleb Dorsey Jr. in 1732. The precise date of construction of this house is unknown. There is on a placard 1738, but architectural historians don't think that the structure that's standing now was built until 1750 or 60. So they probably lived in a less permanent structure until their home was completed. So here's just a map showing the location. The Dorseys were Caleb Dorsey was a wealthy farmer, and he was a producer of iron. He had several iron forges in the area. And this shows his estate and one of his iron manufacturing sites along the Patapsco River. Caleb Sr. died in 1772, or Caleb Jr. rather, and he left his estate to his son Edward. And in 1798, this actually helps us archaeologists when we're researching. The federal tax assessment inventoried the estate, which provided some significant information for archaeologists. On the record was listed the main structure, including 2 outbuildings, one 20 feet by 16 feet, and the second 18 feet by 16 feet. The Dorsey family also owned 36 enslaved laborers, and this is all important information for our interpretation. By the mid-19th century, the property remained in the Dorsey family. Edward's daughter Priscilla and her husband Alexander Conti Hansen, who was a senator, he actually owned the property through the Civil War. They were very social. They had parties all the time. They were slaveholders. And it was passed to their son, Charles Grosvenor Hansen, who unfortunately allowed the house to fall into neglect around 1880. And they almost lost the house to foreclosure, but they were able to get it back. And the house stayed in the Dorsey family until it was sold to Mary and Howard Bruce, who purchased it in 1918. And the Bruce family, they actually raised racehorses. They restored the farm back to its original beauty, including updating the working farm. And this is all important information because they changed the layout of the land. So during this period of restoration, the Bruces added a service wing on the western side of the manor house, and in the process removed a row of slave quarters and older outbuildings. So these outbuildings are most likely the ones referenced to in the 1798 tax assessment. So last September, or gosh, this is my last September. This was well over a year and a half ago. I was asked to monitor a project that would involve, they were putting in new lamp lights along the parking lot that led up to the western side of the manor house here. And they were just gonna dig trenches and run an electrical line through. So I just had to monitor to make sure that they didn't hit anything. The area that I've circled contained new information regarding the history of Belmont, and it was eventually incorporated into the overall boundary of the site. So even the manager of the site had no idea that something was underneath there. You can see where this area is in vicinity to the main house. The two outbuildings that are located here, this smaller one is actually is called the pump house, and this is a stone storehouse, probably the smokehouse. This stone house, we're not quite sure if that's an original structure. The pump house, we believe, was added on, was rebuilt by the Bruces in the 1920s. Possibly a replica to look like the original building. And the manager of the site had no idea that that was not an original. The pump house is not original. So the first trench that yielded significant information, and you can see how very narrow this was, so I didn't have much to go through. I had a screen and I basically screened backfill. So I didn't record stratigraphy or anything with artifacts. They only excavated about 40 inches below surface. That's all they needed to go down. And it's unknown if they actually hit sterile soil. There was a layer of gravelly sand, which was most likely a historic period of fill over time. The artifacts were screamed from the backfill pile. So like I said, I don't know what level they came from, but personal architectural artifacts were recovered. These artifacts date to the mid-19th century, right around the time of the Hanson occupation. We do know from the documentation that a row of slave quarters were in this general vicinity. The architectural artifacts are indicative of building demolition, and other artifacts represent the daily lives of possible enslaved laborers in the area. So we do know from oral histories that there was an area of slave quarters in this area. And based on the types of artifacts, it's believed that this was probably from the enslaved laborers. So the second trench, there's always a fear when the contract workers come in with their backhoes, especially close to the building. This building in the background is the pump house that was believed to be original. Nobody really thought much about it. And I was standing there and they brought the backhoe in and I just hear this crunch. And you can see, that the sound of a backhoe hitting a foundation is the worst sound in the world. They had a lot of electrical wires that they hit as well that were old telephone lines, but underneath that, they hit this brick wall foundation. It was entirely underneath of the building that sat on top of it. Here are the close-up shots of what was found. The remains of a previous brick wall, which lies directly underneath the 20th century pump house, which I think this building was one of the ones that were torn down by the Bruces, and the pump house that's currently standing was rebuilt just to clean the area up a little bit. In the area to the right, you can see the stratigraphy, or the different levels of soil that were deposited over time. These levels tell us a lot about what have happened in this area. So there's actually a burnt level right here. There's apparently a fire in the 1930s before I think the Smithsonian took over the property. And then here's this buried egg horizon, and then subsoil, and this brick foundation is built right into this. So this dates to about, you know, the mid 19th century, if not earlier. At some point, whether this was one of the original outbuildings mentioned in the 1798 tax records, a trench was dug to lay down the brick foundation. And so, like I said, just above the sterile subsoil, you see the darker level. And yeah, so your modern level is up here. So you can see all the different periods of occupation. So these are some of the artifacts that were recovered from this. Unfortunately, because this was a monitoring project, I did not have time to completely excavate the area, but further work was suggested. So if they want to do more work there, they have to do some more excavation to figure out what that building was. But this was just some other stuff that was recovered from the second trench, and it's a little bit later, mid 19th century artifacts, demolition. Then the last trench that was dug, it was sort of on the other side of the pump house here. Part of the trench was disturbed due to a present standing light pole that was being replaced, but you can see the other corner of that brick wall. Somehow they managed to hit both ends, but they hand dug this one. I made them hand dig this one because they couldn't get the backhoe back there, and I didn't want them to destroy anything. So we were able to get we'll be able to get a good measurement of the length of this building. And it pretty much sits directly underneath the existing pump house. So I think they just tore it down and built on top, which is interesting. So this is actually a historic floor plan showing how the manor has changed over time. The top image is the original floor plan from the Dorseys. This is significant for archaeologists because you can see the two outbuildings and then the arrow pointing to the slave quarters. So the slave quarters would have been up in this area somewhere, kind of in between where that first trench was and the pump house here. So this says smokehouse, but this is not labeled what it is. So whether it was originally a pump house, I don't know. So then this bottom one was the Bruce's occupation. They added the service wing, they tore down stuff, and then eventually rebuilt. So this is very important because this tells us that there was something there, you know, in the 18th century. So since this property currently has a preservation easement, no further work really needed to be done because it's going to be saved, you know, it's going to be saved. One day perhaps we'll be able to get back and investigate, but for now it's safe, and you know, more research does need to be done there. Oops. Okay, so this is the site. This is the manor house here. The slave quarters would have been back here, and then the first trench is right around here. There's a carriage house here. They've also done some historic archaeology back here to try to interpret some of the gardens. Yep. All right, so the last site represents the late 19th to mid 20th century. This is a site that we're currently working on. It's called the Mount View or West Friendship Tenant site, located in West Friendship, Maryland, which is right across from the Howard County Fairgrounds. It's actually a well-preserved tenant farm site that was occupied by both African American and white families over the last 100 plus years. One resource that archaeologists rely on, particularly in the late 19th and 20th centuries, is aerial photography. And you can see here, this is a faded image, but this is West Friendship Park. This farmhouse currently still stands. The foundations of this barn still remain, but none of these outbuildings are there. Whoops. And then you can see back here, this, I mean, it's not very clear, but it looks like another small structure. So this was taken in 1976. So we know that the structure was still standing then. I'm sorry, my 6-year-old is not being quiet. So in 2018, this property is owned by Howard County Recreation and Parks. So we were looking for a site to conduct a field school for kids, and we noticed that this structure was there, and it's obvious a tenant house. And so I was thinking, okay, this would be great. You know, the kids can dig up a bottle dump. You know, they'll find something. And then we also noticed this, you can't really tell from the photographs on this PowerPoint, but there's a depression in the ground with another bits of foundation around it that most likely predated the frame structure. So I didn't know this was there, and I was like, okay, this is very interesting. And I found a tax assessment for 1970. I'm going to go back to this image. I found a tax assessment for 1917. And at that point, a gentleman named Charles Hobbs owned the land, and he had a tenant dwelling valued at $200. Didn't say when it was built. So this house was at least there as early as, this particular frame structure was there as early as 1917. This house, I don't know specifically what year it was built, but by 1917, it was not listed on the tax records. I believe it was demolished at that point. So the land was originally owned, purchased by Samuel Gaither, and he owned, I don't even know how much acreage he owned, but his farm was called Wheatland. And he, sometime between 1830 and 1840, he gave his son Washington about 140 acres of his wheatland farm. And Washington built the house now standing on that property. It's actually on the property of the Howard County Living Farm Heritage Museum, if anybody's ever been out there. Its precise date of construction is unknown. Washington is listed by 1840 as living there, so we usually say it was built sometime right around 1840. The house has been altered so much throughout history that even architectural historians can't really pick and pinpoint an exact date of construction. There are a couple beams up in the attic that could possibly date to 1840, so. But we do know that he's listed in the 1840 census living next to his father. Then by 1860, this is the 1860 Martinet map of Howard County, and you see his name circled here. And he is, on the right-hand side, it's the census record from 1860. He is the head of household, and he's listed as farmer. His farm is only valued at $550. His father is much better off at $10,000. As most small farms in Howard County, especially around the Civil War, they had a lot of financial troubles leading up to the end of the war, and his farm was foreclosed upon. And an interesting thing here, they also they did the federal census, and then they also did a slave census to figure out how many enslaved laborers these people owned. So in 1850, Washington has 6, and then by 1860, he has about 15. So at the same year that he's valued at $550, he is land rich, cash poor. He has a lot of his wealth is in his enslaved laborers. You can see this is an interesting column here. This column actually refers to fugitives of the law. He had about 9 of his laborers run away. So I don't know, I haven't been able to get to the Historical Society yet to they have a family file on them. I don't know what kind of person Washington was, but if you have that many people escaping from your farm, who knows? So we do know that he was a slaveholder. They had to have lived somewhere on the property. And then by 1864, by the end of the war, he lost his farm. And a gentleman named Isaac Anderson purchased it. He was actually a friend of the family. And Washington and his daughter Sally continued living at the farm and running it until she married Dr. John Hebb in 1870. So here they have 159 acres. He was a doctor, and this was his residence right here. Apparently, he had an office on the property. Have not found that. That could be gone because of the road. And what slide am I on here? So yes, so John Hebb, he was a doctor, and we do know that they were still farming the land, but Dr. Hebb was not a farmer. So by 1880, here's the census for 1880. Here's John Hebb, and then George Lesher is his neighbor, and then his sister. Here we have a John Willis. He's a farmhand keeping house. So we know that there was a tenant living on the property because there was a structure, but in the 1870s, there were no African Americans listed in the 1870 census record for Howard County for some reason. But whether or not John Willis was his tenant, I don't know, but it's safe to guess that possibly, because we do know that there was somebody living there who was free and who was a farmhand. He was African American and he lived there with his wife, 2 children, and nephew. So what I did was basically to try to trace the history of this tract, I just followed the census records. So 1900, now there's 2 structures. So the Willises, John Willis is still living there with his wife, Sarah, possibly in the original structure. And I think that frame structure was built by 1900 because there's a Leslie Fawcett and his family living in the second tenant structure. So in 1900, there was an African American family and there was a white family living very close to each other, basically farming the same land and working for the same landholder. 1910, so it's owned now by Charles Dorsey Hobbs. And there's another 2 families living here. Abraham Bennett was a Black farm laborer, and William Reinhardt and his wife were white farm laborers. By 1920, there's just 1 structure remaining. So that explains that tax record that only listed 1 tenant structure. In 1920 and 1930, there were 2 gentlemen occupying there. They were just working the land, 2 single guys. And then by 40, which is the last census that's published right now until next year, this is always funny. We're finding a lot of this stuff on the upper levels from this family. James Wall and his family were renting the structure, the frame structure. It was worth $5. And there were 11 people living in that structure. Several children, a lot of children, they were very young. The oldest was James Wall and he was 37. So this explains why we're finding a lot of toys and a lot of children's items. We're finding a lot of like women's jewelry and makeup and purses and all these personal items, which is really interesting. I don't know how long they stayed here because the 1950 census doesn't come out until 2022. I could not find, I can't find where they went after that. So a lot of the questions that are coming from the site, is there any evidence of other tenant or enslaved dwellings? Because we haven't found any evidence of enslaved laborers yet. Nothing earlier than say 1870 has been found. Is the site stratified to interpret the different periods of occupancy? I will say what we're finding now, it's not stratigraphically what we're finding, but across the site. So when we analyze, we haven't cataloged the artifacts yet, but when we analyze, I'm kind of seeing a pattern of where different artifacts from different time periods are coming. Was this a site of an African-American tenant family? That would be a very significant piece of history for Howard County because even for white tenant farmers, there's not a whole lot of history done on tenant farming in this county. And that was a large part of the economy following, Reconstruction. And is there any way that we can interpret the racial relations between landowner and tenant farmers? It's somewhere between 1920 and 1930 that the Black families are just gone. And they completely demolished that original structure. So I don't know if there was something going on there when another landowner took ownership of the property. So these are some of the artifacts that have been recovered. These were recovered during a metal detecting survey done in March. I don't know if it was 2018 or 2019. I don't even remember. But you can see a lot of farming related objects, pocket watch, it was a dollar watch, and then a pocket knife, a lot of horse hardware, buckles, harness buckles, a lot of horseshoes and trace chains. We've been finding a lot of farming tools as well. We've even been finding bits of plows, just everything. It's so much random stuff. This is a leg to a wood burning stove. Because we found this, I don't think that they had a hearth. I think that they had this wood burning stove instead. We haven't really found any evidence of a chimney or a wood burning stove. This is one of the features. It was a trash pit, and you can see part of, I don't know what this is yet because it's still in there, whether it's part of a plow or a tractor. And it was a bottle dump, a lot of bottles. Excuse me, give me a minute. This is another feature that was uncovered, and you can see its angular shape. We haven't excavated past this, so I don't know what that is, if it was another, bit of a foundation that was coming up. We've been finding in that depression area, we found a number of post holes that were probably from wooden support beams for either a porch or part of the structure itself. We haven't found them all yet. And these are just some of the artifacts that we've been finding. I mean, so much stuff, so much cool stuff has been coming out of this site. A lot of doll parts, buttons, beads, marbles, eyeglasses. This white thing here is a collar stay. A lot of shoe fragments have been pretty well preserved. So we're still working out at the site, and we are currently trying to finish up in the field. So there was a cellar hole that we uncovered in that depression. And what had happened was when they demolished the original building, they basically demolished it inwards into the previous cellar hole. And so basically we're finding a lot of demolition debris. We haven't quite made it down into the earlier occupation levels yet, just because with COVID, we haven't been able to get out there as much as we liked. But so we're still out there. If anybody is interested in volunteering, we're working here. We're working at the Robinson Nature Center, and we'll be also starting up at the Middle Patuxent Environmental Area in Clarksville in the springtime, hopefully, if all goes well. This is all of our Facebook pages, all of the information, my email address if you guys want to volunteer or are interested in any of our virtual presentations. I'll keep this up so you guys can copy that down and just shoot me an email.
Thank you so much, Kelly. I'm going to break in and just say thanks. I really learned a lot, and just put another plug for it. I was out a couple times with Kelly at the Tenant site, and it's fascinating. It's beautiful. It's easy to get to. Just a quick drive up from Laurel, so definitely just come out for a day. I've learned a lot with Kelly. She runs a great site there, so there's a lot to learn. I know we are a little bit over, but Kelly, if you don't mind, there's a couple questions and comments that came through, so I wanted to get them on before we stop the recording.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you're familiar with the bed rate across from Laurel, across the Patuxent River on the Howard County side. There's a subdivision called Settlers Landing, and there's a possible story or rumor connection that there might be a slave cemetery in that area. Have you heard anything about that, or have come across any documentation for that?
I have not, but I actually don't live that far, and I'm going to write that down and look that up. I know another, we've been doing, I just helped map a cemetery in Guilford, which is another historic Black community in Columbia, and there's slave cemeteries, and there's another one off of Turf Valley that was potentially have a couple slave cemeteries in them, and it's like off of a neighborhood. So there's a lot of cemeteries that are undocumented, but I'm going to write that down And is it on like somebody's property or it's a subdivision? Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, they came from one of our members. So if there's any questions or anything like that, we can dig it out together. We'll figure it out. But yeah, if you have any questions like that or anything like that, Kelly's your person to talk to if there's something you come across. And it's especially sort of just kind of raises your question. You saw how much the historical records help out, but really nothing beats the experience of getting the trowel and the shovel into the ground. So
yeah.
Just real quick, Karen had a comment also about digging in Laurel, where they live on in the historic area. They said that we have a quartz arrow point and a possible scraping tool quartz, both very white, that came from the ground in Laurel when they dug the foundation for a garage. So they think it's 2500 to 3500 BC. The local archaeologist at the time, Conrad Blady, did a test pit, but there was nothing else to be found. So
yeah, that happened a lot. I know somebody, I'm sorry, my child, somebody in Colombia had also found what he thought was a projectile point in his garden in Colombia, and they went out this winter and they didn't find anything. Depending on where you live, if you live near a water source, it could have just been an artifact somebody dropped on their way to an encampment, but there's stuff, I mean, there's so much quartz around here, and a lot of the natural stuff does look like, if it's been shattered, it does look like it could have been a tool. But if you just found it by itself, it's possibly not an artifact, but that's why context is so important. If you find other artifacts around it. And that's interesting with Conrad Blady. I haven't heard his name in a while.
I know. He comes across every now and then in Laurel archaeology history. So.
Yeah.
But yeah, well, I guess that's it. Let me just stop the recording real quick and then we will wrap up.